I'm Kimberly, 29. Sitting in my quiet Naperville living room at 1142 p.m. Book in hand. I thought I was alone until I caught a rhythmic blue flicker hiding in a binder spine on my shelf. I pulled it out. A miniature camera. Wired and blinking. Seconds later, my phone buzzed on the table. It was my mother. "You're squinting again." The text read, "Turn on the overhead light." She wasn't guessing. She was watching me live. Before I tell you what I did next, and trust me, I didn't scream. I need to know, have you ever felt like the people who claim to love you the most are actually the ones holding you hostage? Drop a yes in the comments if you've ever felt suffocated by good intentions. I want to know I'm not alone. I didn't yell. I didn't call my sister, Paige, to scream about how our parents had violated federal wiretapping laws. I didn't even reply to the text about my posture. Instead, I walked to the kitchen drawer, took out a roll of black electrical tape, and placed a single, thick square over the camera lens. Then I entered what I can only describe as a fugue state of survival. I became a ghost in my own life. I knew that if I confronted them, they would gaslight me. They would say I was ungrateful, that the camera was for my safety, that I was being dramatic. They would turn the conversation into a referendum on my character rather than their crime. So I chose the only option left. I chose the nuclear option. I opened my laptop and searched for 24-hour emergency movers. I didn't care about the reviews. I cared about speed. I found a company that advertised discreet, overnight relocations, usually for corporate executives or people fleeing bad marriages. When the dispatcher quoted me $4,500 for a midnight job, I didn't haggle. I gave them my credit card number and told them to be there in 90 minutes. While I waited, I packed. I didn't pack like someone moving apartments. I packed like someone fleeing a crime scene. I threw clothes into garbage bags. I dumped my toiletries into a duffel. I took only what I needed to survive, and what I couldn't bear to lose. The rest, the furniture, they had bought me. The dishes my mother had reorganized. The home they had curated I left behind. It was tainted anyway. Then came the hardest part. My phone. My father, Luis, had installed a family tracking app years ago, claiming it was so we could find each other in an emergency. In reality, it was a digital leash. If I took my phone with me, he would see the dot moving east toward Chicago. He would know I was running before I even hit the highway. I looked at the device on my nightstand. It was buzzing again. Another text from my mother asking if I had gone to bed. I plugged the charger in and set the phone down right next to the bed. Let them track a piece of plastic. Let them think I was sleeping safely in the cage they built. I grabbed an old burner phone I had bought at a convenience store an hour earlier. Sent a single text to the movers, confirming the gate code, and turned off the lights. As I stood in the dark, waiting for the headlights of the moving truck, a wave of guilt tried to rise up in my throat. I pushed it down with cold logic. I knew exactly why I wasn't leaving a note. Psychologists call it an extinction burst. It is a behavioral term that explains what happens when you stop feeding a negative behavior. When you stop giving a toddler candy for screaming. They don't just stop screaming. They scream louder. They escalate. My parents were the same. If I tried to set a boundary, they would trample it. If I tried to leave with an explanation, they would interpret it as a negotiation. They would cry. They would threaten self-harm. They would love-bomb me until I suffocated. Any reaction I gave them, even anger, was fuel. It was oxygen for their drama. By leaving without a word, by vanishing into the ether, I was cutting the fuel line. I wasn't just moving out. I was starving the beast. Silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the most aggressive, strategic weapon I had. The movers arrived at 2 a.m. They were efficient and silent. Sensing the tension in the air, we loaded the few boxes I had packed into the back of their unmarked truck. I did a final sweep of the apartment. It looked disturbed, frantic, like a shell that had been molested. I dropped my apartment key, the one my mother had copied without my permission, onto the kitchen counter. I didn't lock the door. I wanted them to be able to get in. I wanted them to walk into the emptiness and feel the weight of what they had done. I got into my car and followed the truck onto the interstate. As the skyline of Naperville faded in the rearview mirror and the towering steel spine of Chicago rose ahead of me, I didn't feel sad. I felt light. I was driving toward a fortress of glass and steel in the Loop. A place where doormen checked IDs and elevators required biometric scans. I was driving toward silence. I was driving toward a life that finally, for the first time in 29 years, belonged to me. The truck rumbled toward the city, and my grip on the steering wheel finally loosened. I wasn't just moving furniture. I was moving my entire reality. But as the miles stretched on, my mind drifted back to the catalyst. The reason this wasn't just a reaction to a camera, but a necessary amputation. 2 days ago, I had driven to my parents' house for the obligatory Sunday dinner. I hated these dinners. They were performances of a happy family that didn't exist, where Paige would complain about her entry-level job, and my father would critique my career choices while my mother served food that tasted like obligation. But I went because it was easier than fighting. I had arrived early and let myself in. The house was quiet. I walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water and saw the recycling bin overflowing near the back door. Something caught my eye, a flash of thick, cream-colored stationery amidst the junk mail and grocery flyers. It looked formal, official, and it had my name on it. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a letter from a global tech firm. The logo was embossed in silver. I uncrumpled the paper, smoothing it against the granite counter. It was an offer letter. Not just any offer. It was for the senior data analyst position I had interviewed for 3 months ago. The role was based in London. The salary was double what I was making now. The start date was in 6 weeks. I stared at the date on the letter. It had been mailed 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. I had been checking my email obsessively, refreshing my inbox every hour, assuming I had been rejected. I hadn't realized they sent hard copies for international offers, and I definitely hadn't realized my parents were intercepting my mail. I stood there in the silent kitchen, feeling the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just nosiness. This was sabotage. They had stolen my mail. They had hidden a life-changing opportunity because they knew if I saw it, I would leave. They would lose their control. They would lose their audience. I didn't confront them then. I put the letter in my purse, buried deep under my wallet. When they walked in 10 minutes later, smiling and asking if I wanted tea, I smiled back. But inside, something had fractured permanently. That was the moment I realized this wasn't love. It was a pathology. Psychologists call it enmeshment. It is a family dynamic where boundaries are non-existent, and individual autonomy is viewed as a threat. In an enmeshed family, you aren't a person, you are a limb. And if a limb tries to detach itself, the body doesn't say goodbye. It goes into shock. It attacks. My parents didn't see themselves as villains. In their minds, they were protecting me. They believed the world was dangerous, and I was incapable of navigating it without their guidance. By hiding that letter, they told themselves they were saving me from a mistake, from loneliness, from a life without them. But looking at the crumpled paper in my purse, I finally understood the truth. They weren't afraid I would fail. They were terrified I would succeed without them. That realization was the final key. The camera I found 2 nights later was just the confirmation. They would never let me go. I had to break myself free. And as the Chicago skyline came into view, glittering and cold and indifferent, I knew I had made the right choice. I wasn't just moving to a new apartment. I was moving to a new life. One where my mail came to me, and my future belonged to no one else. 72 hours. That was how long I waited before turning my old phone back on. I was sitting on the balcony of my new condo on the 40th floor. The air up here was different, thinner, cleaner, detached from the exhaust and noise of the street level. Below me, the Chicago River wound through the canyon of skyscrapers like a dark ribbon. Behind me, my new apartment was silent. No hum of a camera. No phantom eyes watching from the bookshelf. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the wind off Lake Michigan. I placed the phone on the glass table. It looked like a relic from a past life. A grenade I was about to unpin. I pressed the power button. As the screen illuminated, the device vibrated so violently it rattled against the glass. It didn't stop for a full minute. 147 notifications. 23 voicemails. The digital footprint of a family losing its host. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I didn't need to hear the pitch of my mother's voice to know the trajectory of her panic. I just scrolled through the text transcripts, reading them like an autopsy report. The first messages came 3 hours after I left. That was when the camera battery must have died. Or perhaps the tape I applied finally settled, creating the total blackout. Christine. 2:45 a.m. The feed is black. Avery. The camera isn't working. Did the power go out? Christine. 2:55 a.m. Pick up. I can't see the living room. Christine. 3:10 a.m. I am shaking. If you don't answer, I am sending your father. The panic wasn't about my safety. It was about the loss of the signal. They were like addicts whose supply had been cut. The blindness terrified them more than the silence. Then, the tone shifted. My father, Luis, entered the chat at 6 a.m. His messages weren't frantic, they were punitive. Luis. 6:15 a.m. Your mother is sick with worry. You are being selfish. Turn the camera back on or I will call the police to do a welfare check. You are acting like a child. Then my sister, Paige, the flying monkey. Paige. 8 a.m. Mom is freaking out. She says she thinks someone broke in because the camera is dead. Just text her back. You're being so dramatic. I watched the timestamps progress through the second day and the third. The threats escalated. The guilt-tripping morphed into rage. But the silence from my end, the absolute, unyielding void I had created was driving them to madness. They couldn't conceive that I wasn't hurt or kidnapped. They couldn't conceive that I had simply walked away. In their minds, I was property. Property doesn't move itself. Then I saw the final text. Sent 40 minutes ago. Christine. 4:30 p.m. We are at the apartment. The key isn't working. We know you're in there. We are getting a locksmith. Do not make a scene. I sat up straight. The cold air suddenly felt biting. They were at the Naperville Garden apartment. They had driven an hour in rush hour traffic, convinced they were coming to save their incompetent daughter from a power outage or a depressive episode. They had tried the key the copy Christine had made without my permission and found it useless. They didn't know why the key didn't work. They didn't know that the morning after I left, the leasing office had scrubbed the unit, changed the locks, and handed the keys to a new tenant who had been on the wait list for months. They didn't know that the apartment wasn't empty. I stared at the text. We are getting a locksmith. They weren't calling the landlord. They weren't knocking and walking away. They were hiring a stranger to drill through a deadbolt because they believed their entitlement to my space superseded the law. They were about to break into a stranger's home. I could have called them. I could have texted. Stop. I moved. I could have saved them from the cliff they were sprinting toward. But I remembered the letter in the recycling bin. I remembered the camera in the binder. I remembered 29 years of them saving me from my own life, until I had no life left. I set the phone back down on the table. I didn't intervene. I let the battery die. They were 40 miles away, in a quiet suburb, standing on a welcome mat that read, Home Sweet Home. The locksmith. A man named Dave, who had no idea he was an accomplice to a felony. drilled through the deadbolt in less than 5 minutes. Christine stood behind him, clutching her purse, ready to rush in and play the savior. Luis paced the sidewalk, rehearsing his lecture about responsibility. Paige filmed it on her phone, captioning it, "Rescue Mission." The lock clicked. The door swung open. They rushed inside, calling my name. "Kimberly, it's Mom. We're here." But the air didn't smell like my lavender diffuser. It smelled like expensive cologne and leather. The furniture wasn't my thrift store chic. It was mid-century modern. Dark wood. Minimalist. And standing in the middle of the living room wasn't their daughter. It was Marcus. Marcus was 34, 6'2", and currently wearing a tailored suit because he had just come home from work. He had moved in 8 hours ago. He was holding a glass of scotch and looking at the 3 strangers who had just broken down his front door with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud. It was lethal. My mother froze, scanning the unfamiliar apartment in panic. "Where is Kimberly? What have you done with her?" Marcus set down his glass. "Who is Kimberly, and why are you in my home?" My parents pushed inside anyway, insisting their daughter lived there. Marcus glanced at the drilled lock, then at the locksmith fleeing toward his van. He didn't see worried parents. He saw intruders who believed rules didn't apply to them. "This place was leased to me this morning," he said, showing the contract on his phone. "You're trespassing, and you broke my door." Christine shoved past him, screaming my name and digging through rooms. That was the moment everything snapped into place. Marcus wasn't a college kid or a frightened tenant. He was Chicago's deputy city prosecutor. A man who puts people like my parents in cells every day. He didn't dial 911. He called the chief of police. Minutes later, officers stormed the apartment, and my family was forced to the ground, handcuffed, and read their rights in front of the neighbors they tried to impress. While they were being arrested, I sat 40 miles away, looking out at the city lights, feeling the universe shift. The cord had finally been cut. At 11:15 p.m., the police called me. My parents had been taken into custody for breaking and entering and were claiming I was a missing person. They needed me to verify my safety. I arrived an hour later, dressed not for a reunion but for a negotiation. When I walked into the holding room, my parents looked small, my father gray and deflated. My mother streaked with tears. Paige terrified. They insisted Marcus had harmed me. I laid a London job offer on the table, the same one they'd stolen from my mail. "I wasn't there because I moved," I said, "and because you tried to stop me." Their excuses collapsed quickly. I listed the tracking, the surveillance, the stolen mail, the camera they installed in my living room. "You called it love. A judge calls it stalking." My father begged me to fix everything. I told him I was. Officer Miller handed me a clipboard. A restraining order, 5 years. 0 contact. Marcus had helped draft it. My mother asked if I was sending them to prison. "No," I said. "You sent yourselves." I signed, stood, and left to the sound of my mother screaming my name. 6 months later, I'm living in London. My phone has been silent for 180 days. I don't know how my family explains what happened. And for the first time in my life, I don't care. I finally understand the difference between being loved and being controlled. If you're living in a house where your boundaries are treated like betrayal, hear me, wanting freedom doesn't make you cruel. You are not selfish for choosing yourself. You are not responsible for managing anyone else's version of love. You owe no one your future simply because they shared your past. I picked that crumpled job offer out of the recycling bin because I wanted more than a paycheck. I wanted a life. And now, looking over the London skyline, I know I found it. If this story resonates, share it. Someone you know might still be living inside a cage disguised as care. And tell me, what boundary do you need to set today?